А я кажу, що ти діставила зали, тобі пані працювати, як?
Ale ja to wytrzymując.
Ja weź pani wykażę.
A ja mam na to, czy z wokoło uszy, jak tak? Okej, ja ją predam.
To ja. A ja to mam.
Tak, ja przyszły.
Ja to sam sława.
Panie, sorry.
Добрий день, добрий день. Добрий день.
Він не хотів. Я вам зателефоную, як його прізвище. Ви мусите його знати. Він знає вас з Манчестера, цей, який приїжджав до свого рідного брата, а той його рідний брат помер. Він хотів приїхати.
Чекайте. Не пекне. Той був у нас в хаті.
Він каже, що то, але він стратив адресу вашу. А я шукав. Я приїхав, ні, помер. Помер. От це я так.
Я побачив, як він
Чи через ваші події?
Пізніше буде трошки більше.
Ми будемо туди.
Матеріал буде, а це не ютубі. То були
I'll put the cross down for you. You can film that. I find it quite amazing that they're ancient. Obviously we all should live in Oldham. What's that? Oldham. Really hot, isn't it?
Because of the deliberate and took everything for even any kind of sympathy.
If you revise the standard pass and you are on the shake again and it moves you again and you can't get rid of these standard pictures you have seen or the standard reports you have gotten and experienced.
Nearest city was 40 miles, so I walk like once a week or so.
Готові і на три. Раз, два, три. Дякую.
Дякую дуже.
Чи можна вас тепер щось попросити? Я всім робив знімки, я ще не маю з вами. Just press the button. Do you want the full length or just... Можна так... посередині. Раз, два, три. Дуже дякую. Андрійко, роздаєш.
Thank you. No, I've been here since the beginning.
Давайте тут трошки, давайте. Ви на раз про минуле. Про минуле, правда?
Він на плені. Слухайте, дивіться, ви тут ще не були при тім столі. Може, ви навіть не знали, що вони... Я не дуже
Кубівська вида. Так, то я...
Скажіть, що то недобре бути кчонкою.
А і також референтка, зовнішня референтка
Чекайте.
Напишіть їй книжку до того.
Ми маємо нове видання «Русалки дійснували». Знаєте, так, з Вінніпегу прислали. Дуже красне, чудове видання, так що прийде колись вам передати. Добре, я можу сказати.
The regular W5 program will not be seen tonight. In its place, a special documentary presentation from CTV News.
Have you ever questioned how much of what you see, hear, and read is really what it seems to be? Not many of us do. And that's why a secret Soviet organization called the International Department is so successful and so dangerous. The International Department's main objective is to manipulate and deceive the public by exploiting the Western media. Its influence is felt throughout the world, yet few of us in Canada know of its existence. This organization specializes in disinformation. It has an annual budget of $3 billion, 15,000 people on the payroll. Its power, in some cases, even exceeds that of the Soviet secret police, the KGB. No one can understand Soviet foreign policy without knowing about the International Department. If you find this hard to believe, stay with us. In the next hour, this program strips away the camouflage from the agents of deception. The agents of deception are controlled by a small group of men inside the Kremlin, known as the International Department. The founder and current director of the International Department is Boris Ponomarev. Ponomarev is the mastermind behind Soviet deception operations in the West. They call these operations active measures.
The role of the International Department in the Soviet disinformation and what is called an active measures in general is essential because it is a coordinating center where all the idea what they're supposed to do are born.
Before he defected, Arkady Shevchenko was the Undersecretary General of the United Nations. As a senior member of the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Shevchenko worked closely with the International Department.
The International Department is the brain trust of all these activities.
They are the people who develop and know what exactly Politburo wants to get in each country of the world. So the ideas of most of the operations get born in the International Department.
KGB Major Stanislav Levchenko worked for the International Department. Levchenko was in charge of disinformation operations in Japan. A major objective of Soviet foreign policy is to disrupt the NATO alliance. To accomplish their objective, the International Department uses the KGB. Newsstands, 1981. A new tabloid, Ethnos, hits the newsstands. Using a skillful blend of gossip, photos, sports, and crime, Ethnos rapidly becomes Greece's most popular newspaper. In a city of 16 dailies, Ethnos is a publishing sensation. One of the men behind this sensation lives in Moscow. He is General Vasily Sitnikov, the KGB's deputy head of disinformation.
Greece constitutes the front line of Soviet efforts to mislead, to disinform public opinion in the West.
Paul Anastasi is an Athens correspondent for the New York Times. Anastasi spent several years investigating the Soviet connection with Ethnos.
One of the key aims of the Soviet propaganda effort is to drive a wedge between the Western allies, and that is what they are doing in Greece in a major way.
KGB Lieutenant Colonel Ilya Zirvilov set up newspapers throughout Europe for the International Department. He appears in silhouette to protect his identity.
It was very important for the Politburo and the Central Committee of Communist Party to provide their policies through neutral newspapers, which were created by KGB because the Central Communist Party can't go abroad and create newspapers.
With the encouragement of the Soviets, Yanis Yannikos, a veteran Greek communist, proposes a publishing venture to George Bobolas, a wealthy Greek businessman.
Mr. George Bobolas, a millionaire and successful businessman, entered the publishing business exclusively and only through his deals with the Soviets. He went to Moscow in June 1978 and signed publishing agreements. He had no ties with the publishing world whatsoever until he was introduced by the Communist Party veteran, Mr. Yannikos, to Vasily Sitnikov, the deputy director of the KGB disinformation department.
Of course, Sitnikov never mentioned that he was the KGB officer. He never used his real job, real position, because it will be very strange if I'll say to you, no, I'm from KGB, please, I would like to create a new newspaper.
Sitnikov used the cover of the Soviet state publishing house to conduct negotiations with Bobolas and Yannikos in Moscow. Neither of the Greeks knew that Sitnikov really represented the KGB.
One must stress that Vasily Sitnikov, although he supposedly was only involved in the publishing field, he was the man who determined the whole framework for the financing of the operation.
In June 1978, Yannikos, Bobolas, and Sitnikov signed an agreement in Moscow covering a wide range of future publications. The Soviets were particularly interested in the establishment of a daily newspaper. Ethnos was eventually founded in 1981. But before the presses rolled, Yannikos was dropped from the partnership.
If they maintained Yannikos, a well-known communist, then there would be no credibility to putting out publications and a newspaper that was purportedly independent. By dealing with a multimillionaire well-connected with all political parties, they had obviously found someone who was much more useful.
Yannikos, still not realizing he has been dealing with the KGB, demands a meeting with Sitnikov. His son Chris was present during the discussions.
My father realized that they were of the disinformation department of KGB, Mr. Sitnikov and Semerniki.
Chris recalls the final encounter with General Sitnikov. When the Soviet told Yannikos he was no longer wanted.
It was in May '82, in this very room, with my father, when we met with Mr. Sitnikov and some other Russians. And then my father asked Mr. Sitnikov why did he prefer Bobolas than him. And the answer of Mr. Sitnikov was that you know that Bobolas owns Ethnos And you know how important ethnos is for us.
The Soviets did not want an afternoon official organ of the Communist Party because that would only be bought by Communist Party members. They had to create a paper that would trap a non-communist readership to whom they would convey the Soviet viewpoints. That is why it is such an effective instrument of disinformation.
Bobolas denies knowing he was dealing with the KGB, yet Ethnos is full of anti-American disinformation. CIA murders Indira Gandhi, a front-page headline. CIA releases poisoned mosquitoes to start plague in Pakistan. Ethnos supports the Soviets on Korean airline tragedy.
The government itself and the public has been duped by the newspaper Ethnos. I believe that they find it difficult to accept that the largest circulation paper has been set up for the purpose of serving Soviet disinformation.
During the 1930s, one of the most popular ways of getting information was the Pathé newsreel. Charles Pathé was a pioneer of the cinema and the creator of the Pathé newsreel. He made the name Pathé known throughout the world. His son, Pierre-Charles Pathé, was well connected in French society and a respected editor and journalist. In 1976, Pierre-Charles Pathé created Synthesis, a news bulletin read by some of the leading political figures in France. Synthesis dealt with matters of French national security and Soviet-American relations. What the influential readers of Synthesis did not know was that its editor, Pierre-Charles Pathé, was working for the International Department. In 1980, Pathé was convicted of compromising the security interests of France. For 20 years, Pathé had maintained a clandestine relationship with the KGB. He met them secretly. He received money from them secretly. This is the only interview Pathé has given.
Disinformation, n'est-ce pas? You understand? Disinformation. I was agent of disinformation, which is completely silly if you read all what I written in my life. Was always.
Roy Godson is professor of government at Washington's Georgetown University. He conducted a detailed analysis of the articles written in Synthesis.
Of approximately 70 issues published between 76 and 79, I can say that there were two major themes that one can find. First, denigration of the United States, and second, basically support for the Soviet Union.
It was very independent, very, very independent. There were cases where you had to say the truth.
But the truth, published in Synthesis, was paid for by KGB officer Igor Kunetsov on behalf of the International Department. Pathé admits the KGB gave him the money to finance Synthesis.
I could not meet the two ends meet of IUC, I could not.
In 1979, Pierre-Charles Pathé was arrested while passing documents to Igor Kunetsov.
It was just the project of an article I was going to show, went to ask advice, etc., as many journalists do, etc. That's the only thing I did.
He is not just a naive journalist as is simply in contact with Soviet officials. He is engaged in a clandestine relationship with the most powerful intelligence service in the world.
I never did anything in the interest of France because I understand France as it is now, n'est-ce pas? Bon.
Pathé was sentenced to 5 years for espionage on behalf of the Soviet Union. He was granted compassionate release after 1 year because of his old age. The International Department's main targets are countries allied to the United States. In the Far East, America's most important ally is Japan. There are 65 daily newspapers in Tokyo. One of the most popular is the Sankei Shimbun. With a readership of 3.5 million, the Sankei is Tokyo's largest selling conservative newspaper. It is as influential as the Wall Street Journal. In 1983, Tokuji Yamane became the Sankei's managing editor. He was well known for his views as a Japanese nationalist. Tokuji Yamane was a KGB agent.
In Japan, I was running about 5 journalists. Some of them were implementing certain active measures actions for the KGB on more or less regular basis. Others...
Major Stanislav Levchenko was the KGB's chief of disinformation for Japan. Posing as a Soviet correspondent, he operated out of this apartment in downtown Tokyo. But his instructions came from the Soviet embassy. Levchenko controlled a number of Japanese journalists. His most important agent was Tokuji Yamane, assigned the codename Kant.
Mr. Yamane was recruited before he started to work for a newspaper anyway by one of the best KGB recruiters in Japan, Colonel Pronikov. Then the KGB was, guiding him further on, Sometimes probably it was coinciding with his own aspirations too. Anyway, he became, still being a hidden Marxist, he became a gradually prominent journalist in a very prominent and respectable Japanese newspaper, Sankei, and in 1982 he finally became the managing editor of the newspaper. He was exerting very serious influence on what newspaper and how newspaper writes.
Yamane was able to insert a pro-Soviet line into the editorial policy of Japan's leading conservative newspaper.
I'm pretty sure that people in Sankei Shimbun didn't know about this, and as well as the owner of Sankei newspaper, to whom Mr. Yamane, Kant, was relatively close for quite a while. I'm pretty sure that he had no idea who his most prominent journalist is.
In 1983, as a result of Levchenko's revelations, Tokuji Yamane was forced to resign. The success of the international department is largely due to the leadership of Boris Ponomarev. Ponomarev has directed deception operations against the West since Stalin's time. The head of the international department is a secretary of the Communist Party and an influential member of the Central Committee, which exercises absolute control within the Soviet Union. It is through the international department that the Soviets run their agents of deception. Recently, at the 27th Party Congress in Moscow, Anatoly Dobrynin, for 24 years the Soviet ambassador to Washington, was named to succeed Ponomarev. The international department spreads disinformation by using front groups and agents of influence.
An agent of influence, what is he? He is no spy. No. He is just an agent of disinformation, I would say.
Dr. Michael Vaslensky was a senior member of the Soviet Academy of Sciences.
He is a journalist, or maybe a scientist, or, so he must have access to the public opinion, to those people and those circles who are particularly important for shaping either the public opinion at large or shaping policy, the foreign policy, home policy, the economic policy of this country where he is working.
I try to influence people, sure. I try to convince people that the way I see things is the correct way to see things. Otherwise, I wouldn't have that opinion. Of course, in that way, I try to influence people. But I am quite capable of thinking myself. I don't have to have the KGB think for me.
Arne Petersen lives in Denmark. As a journalist, author, and the translator of over 300 books, he is an influential figure in Danish literary circles. The Soviets used Arne Petersen in a campaign to weaken NATO by turning Denmark into a neutral country.
I'm against NATO. I would like to see NATO dissolved.
Ole Espersen is the former Minister of Justice.
Well, he had been followed for some time by our police because he had very often contacts with agents from a foreign country, that is the Soviet Union. And according to the police, he was assisting these agents belonging to a foreign intelligence service in a way that was violating our penal code.
In November of 1981, Danish counterintelligence arrested Arne Petersen at his home.
The main charge it showed out was that I had inserted an advertisement which was in favor of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Nordic countries, and which was signed by 181 Danish authors and painters. They charged me with accepting money from the KGB for those advertisements.
The victims in the Petersen case, you might say that they were the more than 150 people who signed an ad who they thought was financed in a completely innocent way, but actually wasn't.
Although the KGB used Petersen to secretly influence Danish public debate, the charges were dropped because Denmark has no laws against this form of activity.
We can see how effectively the people from the Russian embassy had been in influencing him and convincing him to pass on their messages to the Danish public as if it was something he himself had invented, as if it was his attitude, really.
The people I knew from the Soviet embassy, it has been charged that they were from the KGB. Quite frankly, I don't know. I know them as persons, as personal friends. They came here, and they brought along their wives and children, and the children played with our child, and we had a nice time, and we had some discussions, also in politics.
First of all, the best approach will be to become friends to begin with. That is the best story, you know, because it is so believable. So obviously Mr. Petersen was used as a child, actually. I mean, childishly, if he didn't really understand that, you know, there is no such thing that the friendliness from the side of professional KGB intelligence officer.
Well, I cannot see that that is bad, giving information. I mean, when you talk to a friend and you mention people you know, then of course you discuss. It's just gossiping.
One of the men Arne Petersen gossiped with was KGB officer Stanislav Chebotok. His cover was second secretary at the Soviet embassy in Copenhagen.
Stanislav Chebotok. Chebotok, yes, sure, I know. Stas. Oh yes, I know him for years. As a friend.
Finally, Arne Petersen was asked if he could have been duped.
I don't know. I have an IQ of 161. I don't know. I don't know how easy I am to dupe. I don't think so.
The International Department is active in all the Scandinavian countries on NATO's northern flank. Denmark is a key link in NATO's defense. It controls the Soviet Navy's access through the Baltic Sea to the Atlantic Ocean. Another area vital to NATO's defense lies to the north of Norway, in the Barents Sea. In the event of war, Soviet nuclear submarines must pass through these waters to attack shipping coming to the assistance of Europe. Soviet territorial claims here have brought them into conflict with the Norwegians. The disputed area is known as the Gray Zone. In 1977, a diplomatic mission headed by Norwegian Minister Jens Evensen was sent to Moscow to negotiate a Gray Zone treaty. Evenson relied heavily on his deputy minister, Arne Treholt. Per Egil Hegge is associate editor of Aftenposten in Oslo.
In fact, it is well known that Evenson was a newcomer to foreign policy, and that he was very strongly influenced by the views of Treholt.
Treholt was charming, amiable, and ambitious. But unknown to Evenson, Treholt was in contact with Gennady Titov, the KGB chief in Norway. Titov worked out of the Soviet embassy. Michael Spang is the editor of Ferdensgang in Oslo.
Titov had been in Oslo several years before, up to 1977, as an embassy counsel. But he was deported in 1977 in connection with another spy case in Norway. Then Tito went to Moscow, and he was promoted to a general.
Titov's promotion was due to his successful recruitment of Treholt, and the Soviets added the new KGB general to their gray zone negotiating team. The Soviets were now sitting on both sides of the table, but Treholt, having deceived his minister, now had to convince the Norwegian press that the agreement was not a sellout to the Soviets. One correspondent, Otto Johansen, the most senior in the press corps, was not impressed with Treholt's explanations.
Well, actually, I was the correspondent most critical of the grey zone diplomacy. And so when my colleagues arrived in Moscow, Treholt took them a case and indicated that might be I was working for the Russians, since I was so critical of his and Mr. Evenson's diplomacy, which is, I think, a most subtle way of doing it, that the KGB agent is telling my colleagues that might be I was working for the KGB. I think he hoped to kill me by that.
In June of 1977, Norwegian Minister Evenson signed the Grey Zone Agreement without the permission of his government. Discreetly, in the background, was Arne Treholt. Evenson and Treholt were summoned home to deal with the growing government crisis. In an attempt to cover his tracks, Treholt used his influence with the press to portray his opposition as agents of the CIA.
Treholt came to me one day and said, "I have a good story for you. That is only a CIA fabrication. It's CIA disinformation." So I said, "I don't believe that. What kind of source do you have?" "I can't tell you, but it is true," he said. But I said, "Sorry, I can't write that without a source." So I didn't write it. But a couple of days later, I could read in my own newspaper that same story written by a junior reporter. And that junior reporter has later admitted that Treholt was his source.
After a bitter debate, the Norwegian parliament ratified the agreement. However, Norwegian counterintelligence, alerted by a Soviet double agent that there was a spy in the foreign ministry, put Arne Treholt under surveillance.
When the police really knew that they were on the right track was when they followed Treholt to Helsinki once. And he met with some people, and when they got the pictures out of the developer, lo and behold, there was their old friend Titov.
The police had decided to take him the next time he was going out to meet his KGB contact. And they were waiting for that day.
Treholt left the office early on Friday, January the 20th, leaving a note for his secretary that he was in a meeting and would see her on Monday again. He went to the airport by taxi.
He said to his family and to his friends that he was going to Paris. Treholt was not going to Paris, as he had said. He was heading for Vienna to meet a KGB officer.
He was on his way to see Titov. This was a Friday.
January the 20th.
And as he was walking towards the passport control, two men edged up to him and introduced themselves as being from the police and arrested him.
In the early 1980s, renewed fears of a Soviet-American confrontation spurred the growth of a vigorous peace movement in Western Europe and North America. One of the world's largest and most active peace organizations is the World Peace Council, founded in 1948 and based in Helsinki, Finland. The president of the World Peace Council is Romesh Chandra.
World Peace Council has grown from strength to strength. We now have 141 countries, not that you will say it. We have the overwhelming majority of ruling parties in the world are represented in the council. We have the closest relations with the United Nations, with the non-aligned movement. There is no other movement like this constantly growing.
The World Peace Council was created by the International Department as a Soviet front group. Front groups served the International Department in the same way as agents of influence, but on a much larger scale. They represent a variety of special interests, such as peace, students, scientists, journalists, lawyers, women, trade unions, and religion. Fronts rely on the idealism of their Western members, who are unwilling to believe they are being manipulated. All Soviet fronts appear to be independent, but they have one major objective: to further the aims of Soviet foreign policy. Lord Chalfont was Minister of State for Arms Control and Disarmament in the British Labour government.
One of the principal aims of Soviet front and disinformation policies is to separate Western Europe from the United States. Because if you can create a situation in which you separate Western Europe from the United States and close the United States into a kind of isolationist bastion, then Western Europe is an easy target. And it's a target not for military attack. You don't need military attack. You can win this battle without firing a single shot.
The largest and most influential of the Soviet front organizations is the World Peace Council. Michael Meyerson is an American member of the World Peace Council.
It is the largest peace organization in the history of the world, and it's the largest non-government organization in the world. It is, it embraces national committees and individuals in virtually every country of the world. It's got millions of members, and it occupies a place in the leadership of the non-government organizations at the United Nations.
Michael Voslensky was a senior Soviet official of the World Peace Council.
The main aim of the World Peace Council, or practically the single aim, is just to disseminate the Soviet propaganda under the Soviet slogan of peace in the Soviet interpretation, but allegedly coming not from the Soviet Union, but from different countries, from different circles of public opinion in different parts of the world.
Ruth Tosek worked as a translator for the World Peace Council.
It's a one-sided organization directed only against the West. I haven't seen a single document issued by the World Peace Council that would protest against the deployment of Soviet missiles in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union.
The World Peace Council, is it not a communist front organization?
It is not. It is by no means.